Welcome, everyone. This is Mikey Myrna. We are launching our, not launching, we are welcoming you to the series called Tijara, and our special guest is Myrna Atalla, who has overseen Alfanar's growth since 2010 and expansion. Prior to that, she was at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, NDI, in Beirut, from 2004 to 2008, managing its civil society, strengthening its partnerships. Myrna has also engaged in regional initiatives, including women's candidate training and international election observation missions in Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Yemen. Myrna holds a BA in International Relations from Brown and a dual degree master's in public administration from Columbia University and the London School of Economics. Myrna, welcome.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be here, and I really thank you for everything you're doing. I wish afikra was in existence when I was a young Lebanese girl growing up in Florida. And I'm really excited that the next generation has this platform to engage with.
Yeah, for sure. I was saying the exact same thing a few hours ago to somebody. So let me frame why this is part of the Tijara series that we have launched. So typically, when people think about art, culture, and history, they tend to think of, music and literature. They think about art and art history, architecture, that type of stuff. But cash rules everything around me, and the economics does as much to define history and culture as anything else. And because I'm an econ nerd, I love to talk about this. And I love to talk about friendly nerds just like you, who spend their days thinking about how to shape economies in a way that are productive and positive and sustainable. And that will trickle down into shaping culture and really shaping history. So that's why we're talking. And so let me ask you for a really, really simple question. What does Alfanar do?
Thank you for that question. Alfanar, which means beacon in Arabic, has been in existence for 18 years. And at the core of everything we do is a strategic, what we call venture philanthropy approach to social change. And it's part actually of a global movement of actors who have over time, over the past 20 years really, questioned traditional charities and traditional modes of social change. But at the heart of what we do is to provide tailored financing, high engagement management support, because the financing is necessary, but typically not sufficient for change in many of the entities that we work with. And the last thing is impact management, which is sort of to push forward data-driven cultures within the social enterprises that we work with. I'll just take one step back though.
Yeah, go a step back.
Because people look at us and there isn't really even a good translation in Arabic for venture philanthropy. We sort of generally use istismar al-ijtimai, which is like social investment, and still people look at us like, what are you talking about? But what we aspire for is an Arab world where even the most vulnerable, especially women, children, and youth, are able to access the education and opportunity they need to lead dignified lives and to be contributors to their economies and communities. Well, that's super lofty. We might as well be a government.
Yeah.
But how do we do that in our platform? Well, we act a little like a venture capital fund or a private equity fund, and we are on the hunt for ambitious social enterprises, and we specifically within the venture philanthropy space made that choice, and I can describe why in a bit. But we focus on the social enterprise organizations, and then we provide what I sort of mentioned is part of the venture philanthropy toolkit, the funding, the non-financial support, and the impact management to drive that change. And we're a little different because we spend a really long time with these organizations. It's really patient capital, 3 to 5, sometimes 10 years, because we realize, training, acceleration, all these things are, really attractive words, but change, real change, building up change agents that are financially sustainable takes significant funding, significant patience, and, a long time.
Okay. So there's so much to unpack there. Let's start with the basics, which is, if I'm a sort of a entrepreneurial 25-year-old, and maybe entrepreneurial is not the right word, but let's say I'm a, what's the word I'm looking for? Whatever, I'll stick with enterprising 25-year-old.
Yes.
If I'm enterprising 25-year-old and I see a problem out there that I think is worth fixing, how much, and that problem is somewhat related to making the world a better place, how much do you encourage them not to start a nonprofit, and why?
That's another really interesting question, because you're talking about, this is really a mindset shift, especially in the Arab region. When we began, I'll just kind of caveat this, because today I would probably encourage them to set up a company. But, it's important to put this in time perspective. When Alfanar started in 2004-05, in Egypt, we just talked about helping social purpose organizations abroad become self-reliant, resilient, etc. And there are many reasons related to local laws, etc., why we might do that. But there's also a cultural, religious, very kind of Arab-related reason why it's taken time for social enterprise to sort of take off. And it is part of Islamic tradition, really, to give quietly, to support those less fortunate. And so when we began talking in the mid-2000s with, which were jam'iyat, there were associations. Okay, well, what could we charge for that? Could you charge something, because this is actually a monetizable service that you're providing, and markets exist from refugee camps to slum areas. It was anathema. For many organizations to charge was haram, and so that that sort of colored how we first approached things, which was, okay, we're going to work with nonprofits in the beginning to figure out what part of their work could possibly become more social enterprise, if you will, more market-driven. And we really just started helping them track their self-generated revenue, X grants and donations, what their cost recovery rates were. And of course, we're always tracking their impact growth. that is part and parcel of the approach. Now, fast forward to 2015 to the 20, we decided, khalas, like Alfanar is going to just focus on social enterprises, and they need to at least be recovering 10% of their costs. And it's amazing how when you set strategy and set the target and the goal, how things begin to change. But actually,
can I interrupt you real quick?
Yeah.
What's that mean? Recovering 10% of their costs. What's that mean?
So it just means that when we're looking at the revenue generated from the sale of their goods and services, so we remove any grants and donations, and their total cost base, which so many social purpose organizations fail to actually take into consideration, their real P&L, their real income and expenditure. And we really do a simple calculation of how much of your total cost base are you able to cover by yourselves. And what we want to see is that number going up. That's, it's a proxy indicator. Obviously, It's not all related to us, but we need some simple metrics to see if what we're doing is actually resulting in improved lives and stronger organizations that we can eventually, what we end up doing is tapering down the funding so they can get in the habit of standing on their own feet. We provide zero interest loans to sort of build in that mentality that, okay, funding isn't free, I can rely on myself. And we can, of course, recycle that to other social enterprises. And then we create a process, which is exit. not some, shocking event that ruins everything that's, been in place before. And so that's what I mean really by cost recovery is we're checking. And today, actually, on average, the portfolio, despite all of the difficulties, and we operate in Egypt, in Lebanon, Jordan, and soon this year, inshallah, Palestine. But on average, they're recovering 65% of cost through the sale of their own goods and services.
Interesting. So putting that into just straight up for-profit institution, that means they're running at a sort of a 35% loss.
Indeed. Okay. Now, some of them are breaking even.
Okay.
And some of them are, so we were open-minded, if you will. We still, by the way, we do work with nonprofits that are self-generating revenue. We are working with registered companies, and the majority of social enterprises worldwide are actually hybrids. They have a nonprofit entity next to a company. They might have a deed of covenant or a memorandum of understanding between the entities, but it's tricky. These are really imperfect markets, and they're responding to market failures, not opportunities. And so oftentimes they need the two wings to sort of support cash flow over time.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about if you were to rewrite sort of the structure. I make you sort of dictator, world dictator for a day. What is wrong with how international aid organizations and the broader sort of development community, what is wrong with their current approach, if anything, with how they support charities and social enterprises right now? Not to say that they're filled with they have malicious intentions, or they are filled with people who are uneducated and don't have the right eye on the target. But for whatever reason, what's wrong with their current approach? If you could fix it, what would you do?
I really like this idea of being a dictator for a day. Yeah. It's so antithetical to my.
Now we're getting somewhere.
It's so interesting, this question, because it's like the genesis of my movement towards venture philanthropy and towards Alfanar and social enterprise. Because you mentioned my background, and I am actually rather political, enjoy democracy, small d, when it functions, all of those things. But I became so frustrated with the call for proposal, touching on the flavor of the day, driven by whatever international agenda. And then you would see these excellent, well-organized, very intelligent local organizations, community-based organizations, NGOs, whatever they may be, bid for the call for proposals, create a brilliant project, and then for whatever reason, priorities would change and the funding would dry up. And then it was just another feel-good project that sort of, truthfully, if we had real longitudinal studies, I bet created more harm than good.
Yeah.
Potentially. And I mean, I left that space thinking, there's got to be a better way to do this. And we're saying we're building up civil society, and I'm not criticizing, the whole space, but we say these things sort of flippantly, but actually the manner in which we do them really matters. And so when I went back to do my master's and study that intersection between finance and impact, sort of how do we make sustainable change? Evidently, it takes you to social enterprises and that sort of movement that Ashoka began to sort of push across the world. And then on the investor side, because I happen to be in London where the capital sits, right? Towards venture philanthropy, social investment, and now it's a broad space, and impact investment. And you have a really interesting slide here. Impact investment is sort of, we are actually working on launching the first sort of pure focus impact investment fund for the region, sort of powered by our 18 years of venture philanthropy work. But you can see here, out of the more than $700 billion going towards impact investment, the Middle East and North Africa is is only 2%, attracts only 2%.
Yeah.
And there, it's a mixture of reasons. The movement started in the US, so evidently 40% might sit there. And of course we have, MENA is a big wide space with some very, very rich players and some very poor players. So it's not always so attractive. Conflict plays a lot to do, has a lot to do with it, but also pipeline. And not having big enough organizations, strong enough social enterprises to invest in. And that's exactly what we've been working on, is to help organizations get past that really difficult growth stage,
Yeah.
And become investor ready, attractive for either, sustainable, largely sustainable, or investor ready. Now I realize that I have not answered your question.
You haven't answered my question, so I'll let you take a stab at it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would argue is it's as with everything, to start with the end and go backwards. It's just to take a strategic approach. If we wish to see, the Arab world suffers from over 50% learning poverty. Over 50% of 10-year-olds in the Arab world cannot read an age-appropriate text. If that's what we want to change, then we start there, and then we begin to build all of the actors together, and we give them timelines, and we give them space to invest in entities that may possibly be responding to that market failure or issue, but help them to do so by structuring financially sustainable mechanisms to help those organizations continue after XYZ donor exit. And that's essentially what we're doing. We realize it's not about us. We want to create a value, building and productive ecosystem such that if an incubator and accelerator has a really good graduate, then we can take, and it's growing and it has a proven impact model, then we can build on that, but make sure that we're holding them accountable to building up their systems sustainably, and not just running around as mercenaries, responding to the next call for proposals, and just becoming really donor dependent as opposed to responding to their customers, their clients, those people they're supposed to serve on the ground.
Sure. Okay, so you've talked a lot about impact, right? So what is, how do you think of ROI in the sort of Alfanar world? What metrics are you tracking related to the actual entity, and what metrics are you sort of tracking on a macro sense, on a long-term sense, that that you think can be related to the initial impact, the initial investment?
Yeah, thank you. That's a, it's tricky with 20 different social enterprises in the portfolio, different countries and different sectors. And so
feel free to give like actual examples so that we can try to sort of think about it. Yeah.
Wrap your head around it. Absolutely. So we typically invest in organizations responding to children's education, youth employment, women's economic empowerment, and these are really related to core inherent issues that are the region is suffering from. You're giving beautiful examples. I'm wearing Artisans du Liban right now, one of our social enterprises, as well as we're increasingly looking at responsible consumption and the circular economy, or environmental green entrepreneurs. And so each of those, of course, has different impact metrics. So when we enter into sort of a long-term support relationship, we say investment, but at the Alfanar Venture Philanthropy side, besides the zero interest loan, getting repaid, it's not really sort of return on investment as such. But we set metrics. So you have Inaash here. This is one of the oldest social enterprises in the Arab world, 50 years old, empowers over 400 Palestinian refugees across 6 camps in Lebanon, and is also preserving Palestinian heritage. They have an exquisite product. So what are we looking at with Inaash? Well, we are tracking, when we started with them, they were empowering around 250 refugees. They were working in 3 camps. So obviously that growth to 400 refugees, securing steady income, 6 camps, for us is a metric that we've set, which is specific to them. We're also looking at average take-home income. Is that increasing over time? This is clearly an employment investment, but then we're also tracking sales. So, how have sales grown over time? And then those are maybe the metrics that we set, but then in addition to that, we then develop support plans and monthly, at least, calls, with the entrepreneurs to determine what's going well, what's challenging, how can we troubleshoot? We're not waiting for a quarterly report, to intervene, and how can we help move the needle forward?
Yeah.
And it's just worth noting that we develop apps for each investment or social enterprise, I should say, to help them track in real time their impact growth and their financial sustainability. And if you go backwards to FabricAid, I'll just give a really interesting, so FabricAid is a very unique organization insofar as these guys started in Lebanon. We began investing in them in 2018. They had discovered an inefficiency in the secondhand clothing market in Lebanon. There just wasn't an efficient way for people to donate their clothes. And so they have these fabulous bins, set up now across Beirut. They have over 10 stores and different kinds of stores, thrift stores, but then barter shops and then vintage shops now. But they essentially recycle clothing. And what they realized, I'm just going to, refer to that bin right there, was they didn't know when to pick up the clothes or not. And so they have obviously a scale inside the bin that they now connect to our app. So it just triggers to them, okay, now send the driver to go pick up the clothes, to take it to the warehouse, to be sorted, to be prepared, to be resold at micro prices, nothing more than 10,000 lira in Lebanon. So that's just kind of a sense of what they've done. I should just note, this is our first equity investment. So we've just made an equity investment in FabricAid. So that's even before a fund launches. This organization is now branched out to Jordan. They've established 2 stores and they're looking to grow to Egypt. So that gives you kind of
a sense.
A sense, yeah.
So let's take a look at Inaash for a second. So is the idea, just using them as an example, is the idea where you're, if Inaash type organization presented itself, your sort of internal investment committee may or may not say, this could be the Arab world's Toms. And so we think that this, there's an opportunity that this could become $1 billion company. And, we want to invest in this. And on top of all of that stuff, it's also making the world a better place.
I would probably say that the investment committee of our impact fund will probably reason more in those terms because they are going to be driving financial returns to the investors. The investment committee, and I apologize for the confounding language because we just have the same approach, but of Alfanar at the sort of one step earlier, if you will, stage, is looking to see, will Inaash, do we have faith that the model, the impact model is strong enough, that the management team is backable enough, that they really, really thirst for growth. They don't just want to stay in these camps or just in Lebanon or whatever it is, they want to scale. And they are really committed to their financially sustainable model. This is a good example here that you're pointing to now. And so we're going to say, yes, we sense these guys could become break even, which is fine. We're very happy with that, or maybe even impact investor ready. And so we want to provide them with this chunky risk capital because it's mostly grants and it's, over time, hundreds of thousands. This is not And it's patience. It's real patience and understanding and working together. Not to say that we don't pull the plug. We do. There are systems in place for that. But yeah, that's what we would be reasoning.
Their app starts blinking red.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, the verdict is red. Pay attention.
Okay, I want to sort of zoom out and think about the Middle East more broadly. This is not in your jurisdiction, but I'll take a stab in the dark. What economies across the region you think have the healthiest social enterprise sector?
Ooh. I thought we're not supposed to be better or worse in the Arab context.
So what are some of the bright stars that we can look at and say, there's been real progress there, and it's actually impacting change. There is hope. There is sort of a pathway.
Undoubtedly, I mean, we've by virtue of where we're operating, we are, signaling that there is certain movement in these markets. Now, I should note, we are focusing on economies that have greater need. I mean, because the Arab world, there are certainly meaningful social enterprises popping up in more affluent economies of the region. But if we're just kind of looking at the poor communities or countries that have certain challenges, Egypt was our first market, and I really found it interesting that our founder, Allah yarhamu, Tariq bin Halim, who was, Libyan, Palestinian, chose Egypt first because it's such a big market. There is significant need. I mean, 30% poverty, and really that's probably an underestimation. 1 in 3 are functionally illiterate. I mean, these are huge, massive problems, but it had stability and had vibrant civil society. There was action. So despite certain limitations, and it's very strictly run from a government perspective, the thought was, if you can prove the model there, it will be easier to sort of roll it out. So Egypt definitely, and now Egypt has, compared to 2004 and 5, there's a huge amount of action happening, especially in the startup space. So we are seeing a lot more activity, and that's thanks to so many players who have really contributed to the ecosystem. Lebanon was our second move, and it was right at the Arab Revolution time when all of the cards were up in the air, and you realize that Lebanon, by virtue of its history, has always had very strong civil society, pretty entrepreneurial community. And so there are a lot of social enterprises to consider. We have been in Jordan for 2 years, and we're getting to know the space a little more. There's a lot of donor activity, and I think that does tend to distort incentives for social enterprises to be fully sustainable. And I dare say that may be some of what we'll find in Palestine, but I'm not an expert there. Morocco has a lot of activity.
Before you keep on going, can I just ask you something? So would you say that there's an inverse correlation between donor activity to sustainability, long-term sustainability for social enterprise space?
I would say that a really smart researcher should really look into that question.
Very smart
because
answer.
I mean, it's certainly something that, anecdotally we see all the time. And I think intuitively makes sense. Like, if I'm getting loads of funding to just do projects, why would I suffer through,
the gravity of a P&L.
Exactly. Yeah. You said it better than I did.
Because I always think about that. I want to come back to the list, but I always think about that also in the GCC, right? Yeah. Which isn't like donor activity, but in states where, in places where there's a strong, very rich state that has lots of cultural funding, for example, you see all these unbelievably unsustainable cultural initiatives that are bleeding cash,
Mm-hmm.
And then I always wonder if they pull the plug, would that actually make this sector more healthy long term?
Yes, I mean, I can't, I mean, what I will say is that there are areas where markets don't thrive easily, right? And I do believe that charity or, nonprofit activity, I mean, we do need it in certain spaces, but I think that there are a lot of places, and potentially in the example you've given, where it does distort. And instead of getting sort of, change agents to really, I mean, even the word beneficiary, I mean,
Yeah.
it's really patronizing and it's disempowering, as opposed to, FabricAid had 60,000 customers, last year. Those are 60,000, and that's an underestimate because we're just taking the point of sale. And that's generally a mother that's going to buy jeans or, clothes or whatever for her family. And it's all less than milk, and it costs all less than milk. But, those are their customers. Like it's a very dignified experience. I go into a FabricAid shop. There's a place where I can find boys 0 to 5, 5 to 10. It's not just clothes dumped on the ground where, a refugee is just sifting through them. Maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. They go in, they try the clothes, maybe it fits, maybe it doesn't. They purchase the clothes and they leave. I mean, there's something to be said for that kind of dignity, and what that means for how we operate, as a society.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to the list. You were saying Morocco, without going down the entire sort of Arab League.
No, I mean,
but are there places where you think that there is an enormous amount there's a huge opportunity there where there's no one really filling the gap, and you hope that there is another organization like FANAD that can dedicate some resources and some efforts there?
I think that I'm not an expert on this, so I would like to think that actually, and there are some players already, we're kind of watching the space, but we have identified Iraq, for example, as a potential next step for one of our most successful investments in microfinance. It's the Amal project. We started in Upper Egypt with widows, female breadwinners. So 57% of households in slum areas and rural villages in Egypt are headed by female breadwinners for various reasons. And it was a trial really to see how it would go if they got microloans that were given at lower than market rates. Egypt is the largest microfinance market in the Arab world, and the commercial players charge between 24 and 40% interest. Yeah. So it is really, really intense. Ours are significantly lower. We have a 100% repayment rate, and what we found is it's grown to 18,000 widows across 68 villages. We've replicated in Alexandria last year. And when we were doing the growth business plan, because we've added to this with the support of the Global Fund for Widows, something called Widows Savings and Loans Banks, WISALAs, which they've created, which are just absolutely brilliant because the widows take control, over their savings and loans and come together as groups. Anyhow, well, you start to look at where the other countries with large numbers of widows, sadly. We've been looking, obviously, we wait for Yemen and for Syria to be more manageable for us as a smaller organization that isn't a humanitarian organization. But Iraq is sort of kind of up on the list, and we're beginning to do the due diligence on it. With Morocco, kind of a natural next step because it's a very stable place that has the ability to sort of run microfinance operations easily.
So before we get to the quick Q&A and some of the questions from the chat, we've talked about a lot of successes. when you look at the failures of investments, what are some of the common ingredients in those soups? How do these things break down?
It's so interesting. I would say that the challenging social enterprises or investments, and this isn't the only reason, of course, but typically there's this, when you're doing your selection criteria and your due diligence, there are some bits that are quite scientific and easy to assess. And then there's the art. And we often use the first grant as a way to sort of test the waters to understand, what is this team like? Who is the social entrepreneur, CEO, et cetera? And I would say that probably most often when we've had question marks about the senior management or how backable a chief executive is, it often correlates with some significant weaknesses that lead the organization to either stagnate or not really be worth further investment. Yeah.
How often is it related to just like enormous political changes? So for example, like let's take Lebanon right now. I was going to make a joke as somebody who lives in Beirut. I feel like it's not too macabre for me to say this, but I was going to make a joke when you're saying the FabricAid, the Arduino or whatever they're using to send the signal to the app. I was going to say inshallah fi kahraba, like that. Like this box can even get there, right? So baked into these models, there is all these assumptions, infrastructure assumptions, banking assumptions, legal assumptions, court assumptions, security assumptions. There's all these assumptions that need to be made in some Excel spreadsheet when you build your business model that are never in there, right? You're never baking into whether you're allowed, if you're allowed to like park your bike outside without getting stolen. That is not like in row 12 of your business model. So how many of these things fail because of just like structural disruptions?
I mean, truthfully, for us, not that many, because dare I say, although I'm sitting here in London, I mean, the heart and soul of venture philanthropy is that it is not arm's length. It is very intensive management support from our teams. Each portfolio manager has a relationship with only 4 to 5 social enterprises. And, we are in Cairo, in Beirut, in Amman. I mean, so when we're choosing these organizations and we're vetting the CEOs and, we're looking at and talking to the team members, the board, we're getting references, et cetera. I mean, we're working in these environments, we are looking for the backable chief executive because we know it's going to get rough. In some way, shape, or form, it's going to be very hard. And we're looking for those who aren't going to give up easily. And that is really highly correlated with the success of these investments often.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes there's luck too, but to date, thank goodness. But that's also because, maybe our sample size, we've deeply invested in 46, we take our time, we're methodical, et cetera. So, probably if you look broader, I'm sure many will fail. And because, we're also not looking at just the startups. We really we've moved away from startups. We let all the lovely incubators and accelerators take those risks for us truthfully. And actually, there's a dearth of funding, significant funding, the type that Alfanar provides for the growing organizations. And we've tried to kind of specialize in that because that's what will lead to a vibrant social sector that does make true impact change and is sustainable in the long run.
Very, very cool. Okay, let's do quick Q&A and then we'll open up to a couple questions in the chat. So the first is, Myrna, what are you reading or watching these days?
Okay, so I recently read, not that recently, but I really like this book. This is Clarissa Ward's On All Fronts, The Education of a Journalist. We met in Beirut when she was just a producer. Now she's obviously in Ukraine. She is very funny. She is in person, but really the writing is truly excellent, and it's a little gem. And cool. I'm also reading Radically Condensed Instructions for Being Just As You Are, which was gifted to me, which is a little bit more about how to be present in the world. And it's quite short, which is perfect for my schedule.
Cool. What? Say the title again.
Radically Condensed Instructions for Being Just As You Are by Jay Matthews.
Great. Okay. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I think Nelson Mandela.
Nice. What decade of his life?
I know, exactly.
Which Nelson are you looking for?
When he was in prison. That would have been a little slow.
Yeah.
I think it would have been really fascinating in sort of the early days of independence, and how he shaped, the leadership. And I mean, obviously it's led to a lot of what's happened.
Cool. Yeah, no one chooses the jail time.
It's so long.
the long walk to freedom.
Exactly.
Okay, what do people most misunderstand about your work?
In the word investment. And I think it's because we were trying to signal early days that these are not projects. These are organizations, and we should approach them as investments that we both hold accountable but support to grow and become sustainable. But when we say that word, everyone asks, so what's the financial return? So we have struggled tremendously on the venture philanthropy side with that concept. And we're working on kind of clarifying the language. So we often now say the social enterprises we support, because when the impact fund exists, there will be investments that do have a financial return. So that will jive with people's,
cool.
minds.
Okay, so whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
Truthfully, Allah yarhama my tita. So, I mean, I could rattle off like 100 people, but
sure.
My grandmother was like illiterate, and she took her family from Beirut, and with my grandfather, they set up in, Florida and Miami, and then sort of moved up to West Palm Beach. And she was so hardworking, and she cultivated the land, and we ate nukhiyye, from what she grew, and she made mar'u, and they made ara. And like, I don't know how to say it, but she atashitna, she made us so thirsty for who we were, even though we were growing up so far from family during the Civil War. We would listen to the shortwave radio just to hear what was going on. So yeah, my tita.
Wow. Amazing. Okay, let's go to some questions. Suzanat is first. If I've asked you to unmute, if you'd like to ask your question.
Sorry. Yes, here I am. Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Sorry, I didn't expect this. So my question was around you were talking about the difference with organizations who are reliant on funding from donors, and then organizations that obviously are delivering programs that are social enterprise driven and customer driven. I wanted to know whether you have done any comparative study on seeing the impact that you mentioned, and whether there is any difference in the impact that you have observed, or is mainly based on perception and observation?
Yes, again, it's such an important question for a researcher, I think, to tackle. Thank you, Susanna. I think it's very difficult. I think I would argue that it requires a longitudinal study, because in the early days, of course, if you are just receiving, donor funds, you're able to drive programs and, potentially deliver impact, which is higher than an organization or social enterprise, which is trying to balance, the need to, or the mission to create change in lives while also making sales, etc. And sometimes those things are in lockstep. I can explain what that means and give an example, but sometimes they're selling in order to cross-subsidize the impact. And so typically it's going to be a little bit slower than maybe a donor-driven program in the early days. But again, what I would say is if you had a real longitudinal study, what you would see, and this is our hypothesis, is that it's better to spend the funds building out that sort of sustainable change agent that can continue changing and impacting and improving lives long, through time, rather than just sort of drop if the funding drops. So I'm sorry, I can't answer the question directly. I don't know exactly, but that the reason why we're in this space is because we think that we need long-term change makers.
Okay, cool. 2 more questions that I've been asked to read. So Vanessa asks, from your experience, what is the profile of a social entrepreneur? What are the qualities you look for, and can you give an example?
Yes, excellent question. Thank you. So the sort of profile, and it varies for sure, but the type of social entrepreneurs we really look to back are the kind that are, if we can find, as motivated to change lives and improve the lives of refugees, improve lives in slum areas. They're really committed to their impact model, whatever it is. They have some sort of deep passion about the impact, and that is not ancillary, that is primary. But they are completely unabashed and not concerned about, it's not haram in any way, that they want to drive it in a financially sustainable way. And so if I give an example of Natakallam, for example, natakallam.com is an online platform started by Ali and Sara. And she really just discovered that, she wanted to improve her own Arabic. And so why should she go to XYZ, platform? Why not work with a refugee who, especially this was the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, she could both be improving her Arabic, but also driving employment or income towards, vulnerable individuals. And that little idea just, sparked an entire movement. And they have driven nearly $1 million in income to refugee conversation partners, translators. Incidentally, they're now doing, work in Ukrainian. So it's not just Arabic. What began as Arabic now employs refugees to teach Spanish and French, Armenian, Kurdish, Persian. So, it's that sort of, I guess, clear focus on impact, clear focus on financial sustainability, and just total grit. Real resilience.
Let me add a question to that. In what ways are business schools in the region not preparing social entrepreneurs with the skills they need to be able to approach these challenges?
I wish I could answer that question for business schools in the region, but I should know this.
What books are they not reading? What concepts are they not comfortable with?
Well, I have to say that our former Lebanon country director, now professor at Yale School of Management, Dr. Teresa Shaheen, wrote the first textbook on social entrepreneurship. And she's just writing the second edition now. So, we definitely need to encourage, and I know this is happening increasingly perhaps, but, encourage all these really bright spark minds in the business schools to consider how to tackle market failures. I mean, business schools worldwide are very good at teaching people how to seize market opportunities, but tackle market failures, how much further we'd be if we could direct even just 10% of those brains, towards solving some of those problems, and partner them up with the bright sparks in the public administration and public policy and, do good side of things. Maybe they'd be more, co-founder led initiatives.
Okay, last question comes from Selena. Why do you believe social enterprises are important for today's society, and how could they help the Middle East and North Africa's regions' economies?
I think it's staggering that the Middle East and North Africa is the only region in the world where poverty is increasing. There are, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa may be poorer in real terms, but actually poverty levels are decreasing there. And since 2014, due to conflict, economic crisis, etc., it's actually going in the wrong direction for us. And on top of it, you have 50 to 70% of the population regionally that lives just under $5.50 a day. And so they're so vulnerable to falling into poverty, as we've seen in Lebanon, just, as soon as there's, an economic crisis or another devaluation in Egypt, etc. And so the reason why social enterprise is so needed is because we need, again, not to repeat myself, but bright minds that are committed to resolving the deep market failures that hinder our economies, from education, the highest youth unemployment in the world for 25 years, the worst sort of gender inequality gap, again, in the world. I mean, we really rank top in many spaces, but we have remarkable entrepreneurship and entrepreneurialism, and it would be, we need more of this kind of energy to tackle those things, but again, in a financially sustainable way that is, again, beholden to those they serve, their customers and their clients, and not just sort of the halo of donors up here, but really, become valued drivers of change, of employment, of education, etc.
In some ways, I know we're about to hit the hour, but do you sometimes feel like that that person throwing turtles back into the beach?
I mean, I won't lie to you, Mikey.
Because you're talking about like 500 million people.
I know.
Poverty is going up, only region across the world. We have literally money coming out of the ground, right? It's so resource rich. I feel like, how many of those blue boxes can we put up on the walls, right? How do you stay optimistic?
So I've recently been kind of thinking through our theory of change, and what is undoubted is that there is a change. There is like this new buzz coming around. There are more people who are willing to talk about impact, who are looking at impact investment, who are curious, about the space, and there are more social enterprises to look at. And so, and there's been this like, investment. We just need to it's almost like we need a deal share platform, and, a space where and by the theory of change, like you look at this vision, and I mean, it sounds a little like a government. I won't lie, and that's probably, reflective, not just because our board, is supported by such, remarkable people who really care about changing and improving lives,
systemic change.
Yes, exactly. But, and I'm a little like this too, of course, but I've begun to think really what we need, we're a small actor amongst many wonderful actors, foundations, also development agencies. They're doing good work. It's not bad. It's just not particularly joined up. And so maybe what we ought to be doing in some ways is looking to, and this is why we want to launch an impact fund. We want to drive more capital into the region, to drive, the growth of these change agents, but also create a more efficient social sector across the board, because, people are willing to do remarkable things, but they need credibility, they need accountability, they need transparency. We're one of the only Arab foundations. I mean, we're not a foundation as such, but we publish all of our accounts. Of course, we're in the UK, you could find them anyhow. But it's really sort of, we need more of those things, and to sort of kind of not just be one-on-one, taking the turtles, but really sort of tackling the issues that that we have to face. Yeah,
well, I benefit from your work, so thank you for throwing those turtles back in. Myrna, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a really fun conversation, and it's a pleasure to have opportunity to talk to you about your work.
Thank you so much for having me. And at Alfanar VP, if you want to tag us. Yeah. All right, everybody, enjoy your evening and your weekend. We'll be back next week. This will go up on YouTube and the podcast tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.